Good afternoon, Moorings Park. It's nice to see you again. Thank you for turning out, and also to the television audience, invisible for the moment. And we're going to talk today about that rather long, unpleasant history of plagues. My purpose in giving this talk is to give you a historical view of the journey that plagues have made to the current time. And towards the end, we'll talk about the current situation that we're in at the moment, and a few thoughts for the future and how to avoid this kind of thing happening again. Although, you'll see from my talk, it's been going on for 5,000 years, so we have to catch up. The oldest plague that we know about was 3000 BC in China. And here is a picture of a mass grave where an epidemic, we don't know what the epidemic was, but it destroyed the village, and those people who died were buried higgledy-piggledy in this unmarked grave, and their bodies were burnt. So that's 5,000 years ago. That's how people dealt with plagues. All age groups were affected, and that village and the villages nearby were never inhabited again. People kept away. It was a plague village, and it was never occupied again. The next slide is typhoid, and the typhoid's been with us for a long, long time. Unfortunately, in the days when it was uncontrolled, it had a very high fatality rate, so typically 15%. If you compare that with the COVID-19, the world average death rate is about 4%. So this is 3 or 4 times more dangerous, if you like, than what we're seeing at the moment. It originated from salmonella, and the main issue was feces, human feces, contaminating drinking water would lead to typhoid. And the big change was around about the end of the 19th century, when instead of having a lot of horse manure lying around and flies spreading the disease, cars came along. And because cars came along, horses declined, and so it was that the risk declined. But of course, the way to combat this is to kill the bugs and not drink them. And this gentleman here on the right, his name was Wright. In 1896, he found a vaccine that would actually stop you getting very seriously ill from typhoid. And the UK made the next step forward in that they realized that if you kill the bugs at source in the drinking water, that's the safest thing for humans. And in 1897, they started chlorinating water, and we've been doing it ever since. So over 140 years later, we still put chlorine in our drinking water to stop typhoid. In 1907 was the first time that an individual coming into the United States was tracked to see who she came into contact with, and that's how they spread the disease. And her name became infamous. You probably know the expression Typhoid Mary, because she was the one, that first person who they actually tracked to see who they came into contact with. She was the first carrier that was traced. Unfortunately, typhoid is alive and well, and you can see from this map where the areas of risk are. India, Africa, South America. In 2000, there were 22 million cases and 200,000 deaths. So typhoid is still with us today. The next slide is the plague of 430 BC in Athens. There was a civil war going on between Athens and Sparta, and in those days you protected your city by building walls, stopped people moving in and out, and of course as time went on, food levels declined, people became ill, and diseases broke out. And this is thought to be a typhoid outbreak, or could have been Ebola. We can't quite tell because it's such a long time ago. But the Greeks, of course, were great recorders of what was going on, and they wrote rather graphically that people in good health would suddenly get the disease, attacked by violent heats, redness, inflammation, and generally ill. And it was because the city of Athens had shut itself off and was declining in food, and for 20 years this civil war went on, and it was devastating to the point where Athens actually had to declare and capitulated to Sparta, and that was one of the negatives of being under siege. If we carry on, this slide talks about smallpox. This is carried by a variola virus. This is a very, very high fatality rate, 30% of those who get it in the old days. It came from African rats, and we're going to revisit this story about dangerous viruses spreading from the animal kingdom into human contact. This is going to be a common theme through this whole talk. It's a very old virus. It goes back to 70,000 years ago, and even the Egyptian mummies that they found had smallpox. 400,000 people died each year in Europe. It was the biggest killer in the 1700s, until this gentleman here, Mr. Jenner, was working in 1798. He discovered a vaccine, and he worked on a cowpox, which is a minor version of smallpox, and he used that to inject into the people, and that gave them resistance to smallpox. And that was the first development of a vaccine, and that's why he's known as the pioneer of immunization. But smallpox is still with us, and 300 million people have died in the last 100 years. And this very sad picture was taken only about 40 years ago. And in 1977 was the last recorded smallpox outbreak on this planet. And the World Health Organization declared it eradicated in 1980. But we're on the lookout in case it comes back again, because it's out there, and we have to be vigilant. On the subject of smallpox, the next impact on humans was the Antonine Plague around about the height of the Roman Empire, 180 AD. This was the peak of the Roman Empire, and it's named Antonine after the Caesar, who was in charge of the empire at the time. And it was brought back from a war between Rome and Persia. And the soldiers came back to Rome, bringing this disease with them, and it devastated. We think it's smallpox. We're not absolutely sure. You can see the burial here on the right-hand side. It also went east. So this disease not only came into Europe from the Middle East, it went east, and it devastated Han China. 2,000 people were dying a day. A quarter of the people who got it died. And about 10% of the Roman Empire died from smallpox. There were mass graves in England even. It spread to England, and 20,000 people died in England, and they were found in mass graves. And these two gentlemen here are Marcus Aurelius and Verus, the two emperors who also caught the disease and died, devastating to Rome. People, when they're writing about the decline and fall of Roman Empire, they started from around this period, because the power of Rome through its legionaries, the soldiers, was now under stress. And Rome never quite got strong enough to fight off the barbarians who were coming in. You can see the barbarian invasions on the right-hand side. And the famous Pax Romana, the peace that Rome brought to the whole empire, began to crumble. And so many people, when they're analyzing the cause of the decline of the Roman Empire, smallpox was part of that. Again, talking about smallpox, this time it was 100 years later, so Rome had hardly got over the first smallpox attack when the second outbreak occurred, and the Bishop of Carthage wrote, "This is the end of the world." And we thought we got rid of this. It's come back 100 years later, and it talks about the kind of impact it had on humans. 2 emperors again died of this disease, and the empire, which is already weak, was weakened still further. So once again, smallpox considered to be a cause of the decline of the Roman Empire. It even got to the southern part of the empire, into Luxor, and this was a grave discovered by some of my friends who are doing excavation work in Luxor on the west side of the Nile, where dead people were buried, and they found these victims here who had died of smallpox, and they'd been covered in lime and set fire to stop the spread of disease. So there's a real-life example of what Egypt was doing around this time. This slide is titled The Bubonic Plague, which we're going to talk about for a few more slides. The word is from the original Greek word bubon, which is a problem with the lymph node. And here's a picture. Your lymph nodes are shown there and also under your arm, and they become swollen, and that gave the name the bubonic plague. And it comes from this Yersinia pestis, the pest. The French called it la peste, if you ever read that Victor Hugo book. And it causes fever, headaches, and vomiting. And this guy here is the person who transmits it. He will bite a rat, it's a flea, and he'll be contaminated, and then he'll bite a human, and so the disease is spread from rats into humans. And you can see this flea has got a dark mass. That means that flea is suffering from the bubonic plague, about to want to bite a human and pass the disease on. The fatality rate was astonishingly aggressive. 50% of people died within 10 days. Today, it's in some of the lesser developed countries, Congo and Peru, and only this month the bubonic plague popped up in China. So the bubonic plague is not something from the Middle Ages, it's alive and well in certain parts of the world. This slide is called the Justinian plague because 500 AD, the new Eastern Roman Empire was led by Justinian, and Constantinople was attacked by the bubonic plague. So for 300 years, Rome had been free of the plague, and then it came back again. 10% of the world died from this particular attack, and the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, which it carries on until around 1200, never was strong enough again to replicate what the Western Roman Empire had done. Again, a disease damaging empires. This is called the Japanese smallpox epidemic, and we're coming closer to home now. It's 700 AD, and a third of the population of China died. So 1 million people died in this smallpox epidemic. It originally came from Korea through fishermen, and the impact on Japan was devastating. The economic and social impact, like we're seeing today, was much greater. So much so that they turned to religion, and the emperor paid himself to have this huge bronze Buddha, which is 45 feet high, hoping that by building the Buddha, somehow the plague would go away, the smallpox would go away. Interestingly, in 737, the Emperor of Japan announced stimulus measures. It's like nothing's changed, has it? This is what we've been talking about the last few months. Tax exemption granted to the whole country, don't have to pay taxes this year. And to get farming back into business from the death of the farmers, land was given to people to become farmers. This is the stimulus measures that governments were taking 1,300 years ago. I'm leading up to the big one. This is the Black Death. This is the thing that devastated this planet more than any other before or since. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on this. It was so devastating, it transformed civilizations for good. And I'll show you some examples of that. People started to despair of humanity, of religion, and you get these gruesome books being produced. This is 1493, the Nuremberg Chronicles, and they're saying the seventh age of the world, here it is in Latin, is the dance of death. So they were thinking that we've had civilization all these hundreds and hundreds of years, and now civilization is coming to an end because so many people are dying. How did it start? Well, the 14th century was a bad time to be alive in Europe. Populations had grown and grown and grown from Roman times onwards. The land was being over-cultivated. People were living together in squalor, wide open to disease. And it started in a modest way. The population, which was overpopulated in Europe at this time, was struggling because the weather changed. And when there was a change in weather towards colder, wetter climate, so produce from the farming side declined, which meant that people had less to eat. So there's too many people, and now there's less food. And of course, then that led to the Great Famine of 1315, where 10% of Europe died from lack of food. But that's not the worst part. 30 years later, these weakened people in Europe, starting in the southeast of Europe, through Greece, Italy, France, Spain, England, almost all of Europe was affected. Just imagine this today. 40% of the population of Europe died. In modern terms, that would be equivalent to saying 40% of 350 million, which would be 120 million, 130 million Americans die. That's the equivalent to the effects of the Black Death. Devastating. It took 150 years for Europe to rebuild its population, rebuild its economy, and to start moving again. It was so devastating that England and France have been fighting each other for 100 years. They had to stop fighting because they didn't have enough soldiers. So the 14th century lack of food due to Mother Nature cooling the climate and the evil Black Death led to these gruesome drawings, as I mentioned earlier, and they began to turn away from religion. And they say Religion has failed us. God hasn't saved us from the Black Death. And so we started to look for excuses, and we started to blame witches and Jews. People became more aggressive, more protective of what they had, so wars got longer, wars got more violent. But it's this part I want to focus on, which is the social changes of the 14th century crisis. Europe was never the same again after this disaster. First of all, so many people had died, there weren't enough people to carry on with normal house building, and also with fighting wars and with growing crops. And so the slaves, or serfs as we called them, working on the fields had died. So now we had to attract people to come and grow crops, so we had to pay them wages. What a novel idea. It'll never catch on. So the idea of serfdom, slavery, to paying people, laborers, to work, came out of the Black Death. Also, it's much more labor intensive to plant corn and wheat. You have to plant it, wait for it to grow, cut it down, grind it up, turn it into bread. It's much more easy to actually have animals. So pigs and sheep, goats, etc. became easier to produce food. So the shift went from agriculture in the form of grain production to animal husbandry. That was a big shift. Those people that survived then had to decide who's going to get the wealth when they themselves died, and so the concept of inheritance and passing on your money to your family became very important. And interestingly, the last but one item, people started to care about other people. When instead of being out for yourself, the concept of community and charity. Oh, half the family have died from the Black Death. Let's help them. Let's take them in. They can live with us. Let's feed them. They haven't got somebody to provide food for them. That concept was really crystallized during the 14th century. And the other thing that came out of it was, okay, scientists, what are you doing about this? Medical profession. Fix this. Stop this happening again. So, big change in the way Europe was thinking. This slide is about the smallpox, which was in Europe for hundreds and hundreds of years, and how it migrated to the New World. The conquistadors carried with them smallpox. It got into the New World, and the people living in the New World from North America, Central America, and South America had no resistance whatsoever to smallpox. It was devastating. And the conquest of the Aztecs and the Incas partly was because they were infected with smallpox, and the population and the ability to fight back had declined, and therefore the conquistadors, with just a handful of people, relatively speaking, could take over huge empires. The people who also gained were the next colonists, Britain, France, Portugal, and Netherlands. When they arrived in the New World, 90% of the Native Americans had died from smallpox. This is the outbreak of disease in Central America, particularly around Mexico, in the middle of the 16th century. This came on top of smallpox. Imagine how Mexico felt about this. They've been devastated by smallpox, and then typhoid outbreak occurs. And you can see the population drop here, catastrophic. There were 22 million people living in Mexico. After smallpox, it dropped to 14. And after the typhoid epidemic, it dropped to 2 or 3 million. And that's how it stayed for many, many, many years. These diseases devastated the Americas. In the 1600s, England also suffered from plague. And this slide is talking about James I. James I of England, James VI of Scotland, was the new superhero who's going to take over and maintain Protestantism in England when Elizabeth had died. And here he is, fine-looking chap. When he came in 1603 to be crowned, they had to postpone the coronation because of the plague. And when it was reinstated, it was controlled. Less people, less crowds, in case the king got infected. 10% of London died during this plague. The theatres, there's the Globe theatres, where people put on shows, where Shakespeare's plays were put on. They were closed for 6 years. That's equivalent to the cinemas today. But this isn't just 6 months or a year. This affected London for 6 years. William Shakespeare was alive at this time, born in Stratford-upon-Avon. He wrote 38 plays up until 1613, he wrote a play every 4 months. That's pretty good going. But in 1605 and 1606, this was the Great Plague years, which shut down London. All his theatres were closed, so he no longer had a job. So he had to go back to writing plays again, and he wrote some really depressing, heavy, any of you Shakespeare lovers will know King Lear and Macbeth, images of death, chaos, despair. He was reflecting in his plays of this time what was going on in London and England at the time. His landlady he was living with died of the plague. How close is that? Interesting. Shakespeare really wouldn't become a superhero until Victorian times. Yes, he was a recognized writer, a great playwright, but he wasn't the superhero that he is today until Victorian times sort of resurrected him in about 150 years ago. Now, the Pilgrims, looking for continual religious freedom and the New World, left Holland and left England on the Mayflower, and they arrived in North America just at the right time, in the sense that the smallpox had devastated the Native American Indians in Connecticut and Massachusetts. And when they arrived, they were horrified that the devastation, the villages were empty, there were cemeteries, there were bones on the beaches. People had died in hundreds of thousands from smallpox. And so when they arrived, they were greeted in a very modest way by the surviving Indians. Virginia was quite different. Virginia Indians against Jamestown was very aggressive, and there were a couple of very serious massacres. Not so here, because the population had been devastated in this part where they arrived. Smallpox had wiped out 70% of the Native American Indians in those two county states. Now jump back to the 1600s in Europe, and you've probably heard of the expression the 30 Years' War between 1618 to 1648. This was the most devastating, bloodthirsty set of massacres in Central Europe. England wasn't involved, France wasn't really involved. This was mainly the German states in the central area of Europe. Germany and Italy were torn apart because of religious differences. So Catholic versus Protestant, to put it simply. And 8 million people died, 20% of the population of Europe, from the battles themselves, the sieges, and the weakening of people leading to plagues. In the Italian field, 1 million people died of the bubonic plague. The worst single event was the sack of Magdeburg, where 25,000 out of 30,000 Protestants were butchered by a Catholic army. This was the worst event during that 30-year period. And if you want to see what it was like to be fighting off warring armies and mercenaries and the plague, there's a movie called The Last Valley, which you may remember from the 70s, and it just gives you a feeling of what it's like to be living in Central Europe at this time with all these things pressing down on you. It was so bad that in Bavaria, in a little village called Oberammergau, does that ring a bell with anybody? That tiny little village in Bavaria was so frightened that this 30-year war with its diseases and military conflicts was going to spread into their little world that they made a pact with God. And they said, God, if you leave our village alone, we will conduct a passion play forever to thank you. And so it is that only one person died of illness in that village, and so they performed this passion play every 10 years since that time. So it's been going on since 1630. In the 17th century was the worst time for plagues in Europe since the Black Death, and there were many, many plagues which affected Spain and Italy. I'll take you through a few of them. The Spanish plague showed you here that this is throwing all the dead bodies into a pit and not even covering them up, or for throwing lime in. The Great Plague of Seville, 25% of the population of Seville died. In Andalusia and Valencia down here in the south, the plague went on for 9 years. In total, 1.3 million people in Spain died, and it took 100 years for the population to come back again. So in the Middle Ages and late Middle Ages, plagues weren't 1 or 2 years, they were tens of years and kept on coming back, and they devastated the population to the extent that their whole civilization froze and went backwards for tens of years. Italy. Anybody been to Venice? If you've been down the Grand Canal, you'll see this wonderful cathedral, Santa Maria della Salute. And those of you who visited it on the Grand Canal will know the history. And it was that in 1631 in Venice, the plague hit. A third of the population of Venice died in 1 year. A third, which is like 100 million Americans dying in 2020. That devastation led to them throwing their hands up in despair and say, please God, save us from this plague. And they said that if you, Mary, save us, that we will build this church and to thank you, Our Lady of Health. It was completed in 1687, and if you go inside the cathedral today, all the paintings are depressing. They're dark, there's death, it's pain, it's suffering, because it reflects how the people of Venice felt when over a third of their population died. And it's still there, alive today. Unfortunately, it's sinking. That huge structure was built on 1 million wooden piles, which have been progressively sinking into the mud, and the sea levels have been rising. So, big concern for Santa Maria della Salute. This is what you could expect to see if you were in a plague-infected town in Italy in the middle of the 17th century. The doctors used to dress up like that. And they believed in those days that plagues were spread by people breathing on them. Yeah? If you breathed on somebody, the bad smell from the person permeated into you, and you passed it on through bad breath. And so it was that they had a filter in the beak here. They had eye glasses to stop any of the breath getting onto their eyes. They had a black hat that signified a doctor. Doctors wore big black hats. And they would not come too close. They would inspect you by poking you with a stick. Quarantine is the way to treat plagues. And the history of quarantine is shown here. So back in the Byzantine period, they came up with, if you see somebody who's got a plague, put them in their house, don't let them mix with other people, and even shut down sections of the town completely. We'll come back to that. In China, 600 AD, anybody coming in from the sea who thought may have a high temperature, they would be quarantined. After the Black Death, it became really serious to imply quarantine. Venice was the first in 1348, where any ships coming into Venice harbor had to stay at anchor for 40 days. Hence the word quarantine, 40 days. Milan did the same. Milan said, anybody suffering, take him outside and dump him outside the walls. We don't want them in our town. Dubrovnik later did this isolation. In Marseille, they had a medical check. Imagine what that would be. Pretty primitive, I would imagine. And Frankfurt tried to shut down churches or markets. And that's a big debate today for us. And then we come to the Great Plague of London, which we know very well because of people who wrote extensively about this, and of course the fire which followed. But the Great Plague of London was 1665. It was the Black Death. Yes, folks, after 200 years, the Black Death is back. It had actually come back many times in a smaller way. 1347 was the original Black Death, then 1563, 1603. So the Black Death keeps coming back. And so when it broke out again in 1665, people left London in droves. And Charles II, the King of England, he went to his country estate to get away from the risk. It started in April, it got worse in the summer hot months, and it was brought upon the population by fleas who bit into rats which were infected and then got into the human system. And we'll come back to that in a moment. 100,000 people died, and 20%, a fifth, 1/5 of London died from this plague. Interestingly, the plague shut down all universities. And Cambridge University, where Isaac Newton was teaching maths, was shut down for 18 months. And everybody was told to go home, and the professors were told to go home, and so he did. He went to live with his mother in Cambridgeshire, and he spent his summers underneath a tree, an apple tree, thinking, and one day an apple fell out of the tree, landed beside him, and he came up with the concept of gravity. And during that period of the plague years, as he called them, the 1.5 years of the plague affecting all of London and northern and the southern counties, he invented calculus, gravity, light, and the reflecting telescopes. That's pretty intense stuff because he had nothing else to do. He had plenty of time sitting underneath the apple tree. He published this in a book called Principia, which is this thick and is almost impossible to read. But when he was approaching the end of his life, he was the superstar of science, of course, throughout the world. And he was asked, why don't you keep on doing new stuff? And he said, to explain all nature is too difficult, much better to do a little with certainty and leave the rest to others. And that other, by the way, was going to be 150 years later when Albert Einstein came along. But Samuel Pepys, there he is, was in the middle of this plague and stayed in London, and he recorded in his diary what was going on in London during the plague. It was the first time somebody had stayed and wrote about a major plague. And he talks about the major events that took place, but he also talked about what's it like to be in the middle of a plague, everyday life. He talked about kind of food and wine, how often he went to the bathroom. Who needs to know that? He talked about how much money he had or didn't have. He talks about the things he bought with his money. He complained about his cat who kept on waking him up in the middle of the night and so on. Talked about relationships with his wife, but he wrote that in code, so nobody's quite sure exactly what went on. After 10 years, his wonderful diaries stopped overnight. He was going blind. He couldn't write by candlelight anymore. But from him and other authors and also government records, we start to get a first-hand feel for what it's like to be in the middle of a plague in London in 1665. It had come from Amsterdam the year before. In 1664, 10,000 people died in Amsterdam from the plague. And then a sailor brought it across to London, and in 1665, it popped up. In April, the first deaths were noted. In June, people started to shut down homes. And in those days, if you had a plague victim in your house would be locked. People can't get out, and people can't get in. And you'd have a red cross painted on your door. These people are there to keep you inside. If you tried to get out, even if you weren't suffering from plague, you were pushed back in again. And in this, there's a town crier saying, he's ringing his bell, saying, keep away, plague house, keep away. By September, 7,000 people were dying every week in London. And so it was that the Lord Mayor of London said, we better do something about this, otherwise we're all going to go. And he wrote the plague orders. There they are. That's the first page of his orders to London. First of all, quarantine the infected and their houses, which was done. Collect the bodies at night. Remember that old English expression? Bring out your dead, bring out your dead. Well, at night, you'd have a cart, and you bring out your bodies, put them in the cart, and then they would take it to a mass grave, and they'd bury the people at night. So you didn't see them coming out of the houses, because that's a morale problem, and you didn't see people being buried. Watch out for troublesome people. Make sure they go back inside their homes. 9 p.m. curfew. Schools, bars, coffee shops, all closed. Stop the spread. And you are responsible for the pavement, the street outside where you live. You have to keep that clear of trash. More and more of these records are turning up. This one is, they had people to go around collecting trash, extra clean, to stop, they thought, the build-up of the plague in the streets. Burn your clothes. Leave the city as quickly as you can. Bury the dead. And they prohibited plays and bear baiting. And we don't do much bear baiting these days, but it was very popular in London at the time, and that was stopped. No more singing shows. Throw the beggars and the rogues out, because they could be carriers. And all the people fixing clothes, repairing clothes, or selling second-hand clothes were shut down. It wasn't just London, of course. In 1720, the plague of Marseille hit, and this had come in from the east by a ship. Brought through rats and fleas again. 30% of the population of Marseille in the south of France died. This was the last time the bubonic plague was seen in Europe in a serious fashion. It spread to Russia. This is the famous Catherine the Great, and the chaos that the plagues brought in Moscow was well recorded, and she introduced 2 decrees. She said all factories which are important to manufacture things must leave Moscow and go to other cities. 100,000 people died, and there were riots in the street, and even 2 or 3 years later, the country hadn't come back to a stable situation. She barely hung on to power. This slide talks about the yellow fever, which we know about from the past, but the yellow fever attacked Philadelphia in 1793. Anybody from Philadelphia? Do you remember those days, Martha? 1793? It came from African mosquitoes. And it was interesting, they thought that black people were immune, and so they became very popular for nursing. When the mosquitoes died in that winter, the epidemic collapsed, although 15% of the people who caught it died. A vaccine was discovered in 1937, but every year in Africa, people are dying from yellow fever. Florence Nightingale, she was astonished at the death rate of people who, from the Crimean War, they had survived the battle, they were injured, they went to hospital, and 42% of people who came to hospital from an injury in the battlefield died. Almost half the people who came in didn't go out again. She thought this was atrocious, so she and some nurses went out to Istanbul, and you can still go to Scutari Hospital in the east side of Istanbul. You can see where she worked, and she just followed good hygiene procedures. There's no rocket science here, folks. Clean the hospital floors and walls. Clean the sheets and blankets. That's a novel idea. Don't allow people to go to the toilet in their beds. Wash your hands. Have a clean uniform for the nurses. Give good food. Clean the bandages and instruments. And don't pass the instruments from one person to another. And stop staff working themselves to death. And in a matter of months, she reduced the death rate from 42% to 2%. And that's the basis of fundamental hygiene in hospitals and nursing today. And she was given the title the Lady of the Lamp because she actually started the concept of hygiene. Cholera. This slide talks about cholera. Cholera was a killer in the 19th century in Europe. 200,000 people in America and Europe would die each year. In Russia, 1 million people died in a period of 10 years. This was a major killer. Nobody understood at that time why cholera, where it came from, and why it was so deadly. Until this gentleman, William Farr, produced this graph. He was a statistician, and he said, let's look at London and see where people are dying. And he noticed that the further away from the river you got, and the higher you lived on the hills, the less you died. He said, oh, that's interesting. So somehow, this disease, cholera, is linked to water. The further away from water, the less chance of disease. But it was later, a year later, where in this particular area, Broad Street, 600 people in a small area the size of Moorings Park died. Concentration of death. John Snow said, there must be something about Broad Street that's causing this disease. And he went back to the single pump which gave water to the whole of the community. And he took samples, and he found that the sewers, when people flushed their toilets, it went into a collection pit, and the collection pit overflowed into the water pump. So he linked sewage to cholera, and that was a breakthrough. In 1859, London was the first city in the world to take all sewage from houses through pipes and get rid of it into the river. Not the ideal thing today, but they moved sewage away from where people lived, and cholera outbreaks are very, very rare. It never came back to England. You thought the bubonic plague was over? It's not. It's back. So the first one was Justinian's plague, the next one was the Black Death, and in China, in 1851, around the same time as the American Civil War, they had a devastating North-South Civil War. Major cities collapsed and plague broke out. 12 million people died in India and China in middle of the 19th century. Now, we didn't take notice of this because we live so far away, but this is an Eastern plague. In that period of the 400 million people who lived in China, 40 million people died, 10% from plague and civil war and starvation. And in 1960, people are still dying in parts of China from this disease. Now we're going to move on to something closer to home, flu. And here is a picture of a flu virus. And there are two parts to point out. There's this thing here, these yellow spiky things, and there's these things here, the red dots. And those are the main killers of a virus. The yellow bits binds the virus to a living cell, so it attacks this living cell, and the red bits then spreads the disease, the virus, from one cell to the next. Those two things are the fundamentals of flu. And we call it different names, but it all depends on how many H's there are and how many N's there are. Now, you've heard the example of H1N1. Does that ring a bell? Yeah? Or you could have H1N2, and it depends on the ratio of these two bits of the virus. The Russian flu of 1890 was called by the H2N2 flu, and that came from birds. So birds had passed this virus on to humans. That's what it looked like. Now this flu spread really quickly because people are now traveling rapidly through transportation advances. And so it spread across Russia and across the whole of the globe. And in 5 weeks, 1 million people had died. And all of a sudden, the world woke up to the fact that plagues were no longer in one geographical area. People were moving around so much, they were taking the plagues with them. The one that we vaguely remember, because it was not too long ago, 100 years ago, was the dreaded Spanish flu. And this was called an H1N virus. It came from pigs. And that's one of my themes. Most of these killer viruses come from animals into the human system. 50 million people died globally. 700,000 people died in the US. So the US woke up and realized the Spanish flu was serious. Why was it called the Spanish flu? Because the Spanish king got the flu but didn't die. Interestingly, and here we start to get modern medicine analyzing who dies and who doesn't, the young people, less than 5 years old, died more readily because the older people had already had exposure to the flu and they had antibodies. The young people were the people who suffered the most. There were 3 waves, and this is a warning to us that these plagues don't just come and go in a very defined time period. They hang around. They come back and revisit us. And that's the concern that we have in the world today is, will this come back? How long will this carry on for? And here's an example. In March, the first Spanish flu case was notified from the Kansas Army camp. These were soldiers going off to war, and they took this flu with them to Europe. By the fall, it would come back again. And again, in March the next year, it came back again. So this is a 3-pronged attack. This is the photograph which made us currently with the COVID-19 system say we shouldn't meet in large numbers of people. And this was Philadelphia. And this was a Liberty Loan, war bonds raising. Come out and support America, support the army, support the government with money, invest in bonds. And they all met on this famous parade. 200,000 people from Philadelphia came out in the middle of the Spanish flu. Philadelphia, per 100,000 inhabitants, had 5 times the death of St. Louis because they mixed in large numbers like this. And that's why we now have the philosophy from this very tragic event that stay indoors, don't mix. Another plague, if you like, was the polio epidemic, which when I was growing up as a kid was a really serious risk. There were 6,000 people died in 1920s from polio, mostly children, and if they didn't die, they had very bad damage to their legs. I remember some of my schoolmates had metal support for their legs because their legs were damaged from polio. FDR, President Roosevelt, got it in 1921, and he needed metal supports in his legs to stand up. In 1954, Salk came up with a vaccine, and the last polio case that's known was 1979. So medical technology has saved us from that. But it's still out there in the rest of the world. In the 50s, the next flu was the bird flu. It came from birds, from wild ducks. Fatality was tiny. Didn't really affect the whole world very severely. In the coastal cities of the US, 70,000 people died. The vaccine it was developed in 1957, slowed the pandemic. It didn't grow into what we see today. And this is the progression of the different types of flu. H1, H1N, H2N2, and so on. So it keeps on morphing. The message of this particular slide is that you're firing at a moving target. This virus is morphing all the time. The Hong Kong flu came in the 60s. It appeared in Hong Kong in 1968. Vietnamese war veterans brought it back home, but only 0.5% fatality rate. So yes, we knew about the Hong Kong flu. Only 100,000 people died in the US. AIDS. This is what an AIDS virus looks like. AIDS came originally from chimps. In the 1920s, chimpanzees carry the SIV, which is a simian immunovirus. And somehow it spread from chimpanzees to humans, probably through blood transfer. And it led to HIV, human immunodeficiency virus. And then if you got that, you had a very likelihood of getting the killer, which was the acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. We call it AIDS. So HIV often led to AIDS. It claimed 35 million lives, and it's considered a pandemic in the late 20th century. AIDS is still with us. 64% of people living in sub-Saharan Africa are still suffering from AIDS. In the West, there have been great advances to reduce the fatalities from HIV to AIDS. And that is where AIDS is prospering at the moment in that part of Africa. In the 90s, medication was brought in that allowed people to live longer with HIV and stop the thing accelerating into an AIDS. And of course, remember the Philadelphia movie? That was really brought people's attention to the suffering from AIDS. Amazingly, in 2020, the medical profession actually cured the first 2 people in the world of AIDS. It was horribly expensive. It meant changing their bone marrow, but they've actually cured people of HIV. Now we're going to come on to the current issue, which is the coronavirus. And there is a picture of the horrible coronavirus. Coronavirus in its mild form gives you a sneeze. But in a lethal form, we're going to talk about these later, SARS, you remember, MERS, and COVID-19 is the lethal version of the mild common cold. And it's called a coronavirus because if you look at it through a microscope, it looks like it's got a ring around it like the sun, the corona of the sun. It's been around forever. It's been identified 8,000 BC. 10,000 years ago, they found the bodies of bats that lived that time, and it had the coronavirus in the bats. So it's not a new thing. In the 1960s, it was found in chickens, and then it spread to humans, and it spread through respiratory droplets, which is why we're wearing masks. The first outbreak was 20 years ago. It was called coronavirus 1. We're now coronavirus 19. And it was called severe acute respiratory syndrome, SARS. Do you remember the expression, SARS, vaguely, back in 20 years ago? It came out of horseshoe bats to civets in Yunnan, China, and then into humans. Interestingly, it came and went. You see that graph? Within 3 months, it had come and gone. There's no vaccine, and in 2004, it had gone away. And so the world didn't really take it that seriously, as if to say, it could come back. It could come back in different form. We didn't actually pursue that. 2009 was the swine flu, new strain of the Spanish flu. It's the Spanish flu has come back in a slightly different form, and it came from pigs in Mexico, and 1.4 billion people got it, but only a couple 100,000 people died. In America, only 60,000 people died, which is a lot, of course. That's the population of Fort Myers. In relation to the population of the country, not so significant. It affected children and young adults. 80% of the deaths were young people again, because the older people had been through the contact with flus before. And the vaccine that they developed for H1N1 is what you get in your annual flu jabs. So when you go along in the fall to have your flu jabs, it'll be some version of H1N1. But you and I now know there are lots of different types of flu diseases. The next warning for us was 2012 and 2015 when MERS came along. Now, again, a coronavirus, the same one we're struggling with today, causes problems in the lungs, as you can see, and it's called MERS because it was found in Saudi Arabia, first of all. So that's why it's called the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, MERS. It went from bats to camels to humans. Very, very few people were affected in America because it was a Middle East disease. And again, 3 months later, it had gone away. Ebola, I just mentioned briefly, that's been around since 2014, brought from bats, spread by blood contact, mostly in West Africa, which is why you're warned when traveling to Central and West Africa, Nigeria, Mali, Senegal, watch out because it is predominant there. There's no cure for Ebola, so it's fatal. Zika is another of these horrible things. It was found in Uganda in 1947, and it's still going on. The Zika epidemic is still going on in these countries here. So the Brazil area, the bits of western Mexico, parts of West Africa, and elsewhere in the Far East. Wherever the mosquito that brings it lives, it's not so much a big killer, but if you get it, and you're pregnant, it actually damages the fetus, which is the sad part. It is declining, but this is the spray system that people use to kill off the mosquito that carries the disease. So to come to a bit of a close, this is the history of plagues as far as we know it. So we go back to the Antonine Plague, and the size of these viruses is representing the number of people who died. So the where are we? This is the current situation. 650,000 people, as of yesterday, had died from COVID-19. And you can see there's the Spanish flu, here's HIV/AIDS. So in terms of other plagues, not so big. And in terms of people who died, again, remember this is now updated, 650,000 people across the world has died from COVID-19. Look at that. Compared to Black Death, 200 million people died from the Black Death. That's why it's so devastating. And then smallpox, Spanish flu, Justinian's plague, HIV, and so on. And we're down here. So in relation to the history of plagues, it is still modest, to put it in perspective. Could we have done something about the coronavirus? The coronavirus tends to morph, changes its nature. Look at this pattern. 2003, it was SARS. No big deal. Nobody died from it in America. 2004, the coronavirus was killing people in Holland. One person died. 2005, it killed a 70-year-old man in Hong Kong. Coronavirus. In 2012, 800 people died in the Middle East. All coronavirus variations. On the 17th of November 2019, a patient was found in Wuhan in China demonstrating the coronavirus. And it was suspected that the wet market, as they call it in China, where you bring live animals to a market, you bring dead animals to a market, you bring humans to the market, and they all mix together, and the virus transmits from one species to another until it gets into the human system. They think it was probably a bat that ate a kind of an anteater called a pangolin, and that was used as food, and that passed on the disease somehow. The worrying thing about COVID-19 was it spreads very quickly, much quicker than previous coronaviruses. But, and here's a shocker, we woke up to it when the pandemic was called in March. No, sorry, was it March? The coronavirus was found quite recently in water samples, much earlier than that. So, for instance, in Barcelona, they found from wastewater samples they keep for testing, they've actually gone back to the 12th of March last year, 2019, they found the coronavirus was in humans in Spain. Italy did the same thing. They found the coronavirus was in humans in December. So the belief that it came from China is slightly questioned. It probably was more common throughout the world. Why wasn't it recognized, you say, earlier on in Europe? Because the people who died were diagnosed as having died from flu. It's only as time went on they realized it wasn't the flu, it was the coronavirus. In March, it was that the World Health Organization said it's a pandemic across the whole world, and they predicted 5% of the people who get it will die. Remember that 5%. But for the people over 80, it's 3 times that level, as you can see from this scary graph. And now the medical research is coming out with those people who survive COVID-19 may be compromised. Their lungs may well be compromised and may affect their longevity. You remember the flattening the curve? Flattening the curve concept was based on the Philadelphia St. Louis. For heaven's sake, if you've got something like this around, stay at home. Don't mix with other people. It may not stop the spread of the disease completely, but it stops you overwhelming the healthcare system. Because remember a few months ago, many hospitals were saying, we can't treat any more patients. So the idea of staying at home and flattening the curve was, let's make sure that people who do get it can be treated in hospitals. And there's just a few humorous things that my daughter sent me. Why is there a toilet paper shortage? And she did some research, and she came up with the explanation that when you buy toilet paper from a grocery shop, you buy expensive toilet paper, which is double ply or triple ply. When you go to an office location, they're buying cheaper toilet paper, which is single ply. So all of a sudden, because people weren't going to the offices, they were staying at home, using much more toilet paper than before, and the toilet paper industry couldn't keep up. And that's the explanation. And of course, there are all sorts of silly things that she sent me, like a bouquet of toilet paper rolls, panic room. She obviously hasn't got enough work to do in San Diego. As of yesterday, look at that, 4%. That's exactly what the World Health Organization, pretty much they said 5%. So 5% of the people who get it will die, and the United States is pretty much in line with the world situation. And this is worth putting in perspective. I mean, we look in the paper every day or watch the news on television, and they say, oh my goodness, more people have died in America. More people have got the disease in America. How do we compare with the rest of the world? Are we better or worse in terms of fatalities? And this is the most powerful graph I follow. This stops in June, but this is the latest number. You shouldn't look at the number of absolute people who've died, because that depends on population. A country with a big population will have more people dying. What you should do is look at the number of people who died divided by the population. So it's expressed as the people who died per 100,000 inhabitants. And that way you take out large population countries and you look at the fundamentals. And the fundamentals is that Belgium has 85 people who die per 100,000. So they are the top, if you like. They're the worst country in the world. UK, not far behind. Spain, Italy, Sweden, France in the 50s and 60s. United States, in fact, is this, the graph is this black one. Sorry, USA is here. The latest number for the United States is 43. So we are below most of the other high population countries. So we shouldn't think that this is a particularly American disaster we've got in our hands. Yes, it's terrible that people are dying, but in relation to the world in general, the United States is has much less fatalities than these other countries. And of course, what the analysts are doing is saying, why is Germany, which is this one, so low? What are they doing that we're not doing? Sweden has jumped up to 56 recently. They opened their schools, they opened their offices much earlier than we did, and now they're having second thoughts. So, let's just take a moment to talk about Jane Goodall. Do you remember Jane Goodall back in the 60s? She was in Tanzania. There's a picture of her when she was a young lady doing research on chimps. So she studied chimpanzees all her life. And she was interviewed in April this year, and she made these following comments during the interview. The current pandemic was predicted. We've seen lots of warnings for it over the last 20 years. We do not learn from the past, which is why I'm giving this talk today. This is a 5,000-year-old problem. And the problem, she said, and this is her words, she says the problem is that we've expanded our world. There's so many people in our world that we're now invading more and more the animal areas. And we're not respecting their separation, and consequently living closer to animals, bringing more animals into our lives, has meant that diseases are spreading from animals to humans. And nearly all of the plagues we've talked about have originated from animals migrating into humans. Of course, it's easy to look back and say, what did we do wrong? But in 2005, in the 7th of July, the CDC, 2 researchers wrote a paper. 2005, 15 years ago. They wrote this paper. They said, we think we should develop a vaccine for the corona. They said that developing an effective and safe vaccine is urgently needed to prevent one of these things coming back. 15 years ago, they asked for money to develop a vaccine. It takes a long time to develop a vaccine. This is the typical length it takes to develop a vaccine, 2 years. So if we get one by Christmas, that's really, really fast. Normally it's a 2-year period. But we stopped research funding to find a vaccine, and we cut back hospital preparedness by half. So Jane Goodall is saying that we brought this partly upon ourselves. So when this is all gone, how will it leave the world? And I just remind you of that slide I showed you earlier. There were huge changes which came about because of the Black Death. Another example was a huge volcanic incident in 1816 in Tambora, where the cold period in Europe meant that there wasn't enough food for humans, therefore there wasn't enough food for horses, and so horses died or were slaughtered. So with less horses around, Carl von Drais developed the bicycle. There it is. And replaced the horse with a bicycle. And then, of course, various people made it better and better and better until they had rubber wheels, and this is the most common bicycle in the world in China today. So out of adversity came a change. So what kind of change can we expect coming out of our adversity? And some clever journalist has now declared BC means before the coronavirus, and AD means after domestication, meaning stay at home. But what's in store for us? Go back, how many of us were around in the 1750s? Martha, was that before your time? Sorry. In 1750, if you wanted something, you went to a lady who made a sweater, or a guy who made a chair in his back room, and you bought the sweater or the chair from the person who made it. Cottage industry. And then we got very clever and said, how about this? Let's bring all those workers into a factory where they can make lots of sweaters and lots of chairs, and then we can sell them. And the concept of Industrial Revolution started. So we've moved from cottage industry to factories, and then offices, huge corporate offices where we bring people from their homes to mix together, to work together. There are some people saying we're going to reverse that. And in fact, only this morning, we've seen another major company saying, you will not come back to work until the middle of 2021 at the earliest. My daughter works for TurboTax. She has no concept of when she'll ever go back to work. She's been at home for 5 months. And the business is thriving. They had a 5% increase in sales by people working from home, linking together through Zoom and having Zoom meetings. So the world will definitely change. But it can only manage because of, fortunately, broadband cable. Without that, we couldn't do Zooms. We couldn't have all these communications. But, of course, it only works for service companies. Somebody actually has to manufacture a car in a factory, so it's not all going to go away. Remote working, yes. A large percentage of the population will work from home forever. I met a manager who's recruited somebody from a different state, never met them, gave them the job, they'll work from home forever. They'll never come to Fort Myers or Naples. Twitter, Facebook. Those people with huge corporate offices are now saying, well, that was a bad idea, let's sell it off. We don't need these big corporate offices. 4-day working. Currently I do 4 days in the office, 1 day at home. Will that stay? Why do we have 5 days? Are we working efficiently at home? Yes, we are. The negatives are, as my daughter found out, and I found out to some extent, your day expands. So you get phone calls at 7 o'clock, you have a Zoom at 8 o'clock at night, and so your day gets stretched out. And that's one of the negative features. And one of the negative features that's hard to quantify is that when you go out to the water cooler and talk to your friend, when you mix with your friends at lunchtime, ideas spread between people. Oh, that's a good idea, Martha. Let's do that. So people are concerned that if you stay in your home, yes, you have Zoom, but you may just miss that cross-networking connection that is so powerful. Now, a lot of people I know who were servers are doing okay. They've become Uber Eats. They're going and delivering groceries, they're delivering food from restaurants, and a large percentage of the serving world have actually picked up activities in a different form. Grocery deliveries are a record. Restaurants, most restaurants will deliver now. But we have to be realistic. Many of these jobs, some of these jobs have gone forever. Will the cinema ever come back? Will people ever travel again? I mean, I have lots and lots of holiday. I can't take it. Where would I go? My daughter is so frustrated, she's going to get in her car, she's going to drive to Yellowstone just to use up her holidays. She'd like to go to Peru or Italy or Vietnam, but she can't. Is the cruise business ever going to come back? Where you put 2,000 people in a metal box for 2 weeks? What about me? How many people want to come to college in 3 weeks' time, face to face? We're having to be very innovative in handling those people who do and those people who want to be educated from home. Will the immunity passport, which I remember in the 60s, you couldn't go to some countries unless you had a passport which showed you had immunity. Will we all have to have COVID-19 inoculation when it comes around and carry it with us? Most people, when they write about what's happening now, will say that governments will get stricter, that there'll be more control from big government, controlling whether we wear masks or not. You can't do things unless you have a temperature. I go to the gym, they do a temperature check. I came in through your front gate, temperature check. Facial recognition. Do you remember this in the Ozarks? The Ozark teenagers decided to have a party in the lake. And there were thousands and thousands of them all mixing together. How did the authorities know what was going on? They tracked their cell phones. So here is the government tracking cell phones. Did anybody complain about that? Facial recognition. It's going to become more and more common. How can you do facial recognition with masks? At the end of the day, the stimulus checks have to be paid for. Every country in the world is pouring money into the hands of unemployed people, which is a good social thing to do. Where's the money coming from? Every country in the world is printing money, hoping that one day they can pay it back. Many people fear that taxes will have to rise to cover the handouts. Industry bailouts, the airline industry, terrible situation. Manufacturing of cars, etc., etc. And there's no doubt at all that we will insist that the pharmaceutical and healthcare industries get their act together and avoid this happening again. We'll put the squeeze on them. They did a great job, the hospitals, but we want them to be better. Let me finish off with a little bit of prediction. In 2018, the World Health Organization published a book saying, watch out, disease X is coming. This is 2 years ago. They said, a pathogen we don't know today will emerge. It'll probably come from an animal, where we are close to those animals. It'll be more deadly than flu, but it spreads as quickly. It'll hitch a ride on tourism and trade around the world very fast. So it'll spread outside its origin in a matter of weeks. It'll jump from one continent to another. It will cause a major pandemic, and it'll be economic and social devastation 2 years ago. And we know its name now. It's not disease X, it's COVID-19. So people have been warning the world to start to do investigation to find out where the next one's coming from. There's no point reacting to disease X. We have to be predicting disease Y, disease Z. And how do we do that? The suggestion is, and it's a massive piece of work, we go out to all the animals, take samples, and see if there are any viruses which are pathogens, which could kill humans. When we find them, we then start working on a vaccine so that when it does break into the human cycle, we've got a vaccine sitting there ready to go. That's the latest thinking of going forward. And I'd like to thank you for your patience, and I will open it up for questions. Thank you. Yes, sir. The plagues in Egypt, in the past or the currently? In the past, yeah. I mentioned two of them, that we found dead graves in Luxor on the West Bank, where the plagues in Egypt, the victims were buried in mass graves. Yeah, that was 2,000 years ago. Thank you. Oh, you're talking about the famous Old Testament plagues. There's a very interesting study done on those that say it's kind of argumentative because they say those plagues that are identified are naturally occurring. A plague of locusts, and we're seeing that today. There's plagues of locusts in Africa. The water turned to blood. Remember that one? Red tide. And there's a very interesting booklet which has been written saying each of these plagues in the Old Testament are things that we've seen in certain parts of the world already. Not all of them, but it's a very interesting case study. Those are the plagues you're referring to? Yes, good. Thank you. Any more questions? If not, I'd like to thank you for your attendance, and all the best. See you next time. Bye-bye.